Hey y'all, it's Ann Lee, your everyday light worker, and I'm back to get into the history of racism in America and to explain how it is baked into America as a country and all of its institutions. I'm not going to get into the real nitty gritty of that because there is a lot of information on how that was done through the United States federal government, a lot of YouTube videos on that. So the information is out here. But I want to talk about, just to give you a brief overview of how America was basically founded on racism and how it was written into our Constitution. All right, so we had this one founding father in America who really spoke out against racism, or really what he spoke out against was actual slavery, which is the oldest and most diabolical form of racism, especially chattel slavery, which was incredibly brutal. And it goes on to this very day, and it's not even about race anymore. There are millions, probably multi-millions, hundreds of millions of people to this very day of all races that are involved in chattel slavery. So, what chattel slavery involves is snatching someone up from their home and essentially working them to death. And it could be a whole lot of different types of labor, but the one that gets the most, I want to say, the most airtime is sexual slavery. So, the most brutal form of slavery didn't even start in America, but actually in South America, Brazil in particular practiced a very brutal form of chattel slavery on its sugarcane plantations, but we're not really here to talk about that. I've got a question for you though. Have any of you heard of George Mason? Probably not. George Mason is a big name in Virginia. He's from the colonial times, and he wrote the state of Virginia's Constitution. He was a contemporary of Thomas Jefferson, and when he became aware that Thomas Jefferson was tasked with writing the United States Constitution, he asked him, he's like, "Hey, TJ, do you need any help with that?" And of course, Thomas Jefferson replied, "I do. I just threw this whole Constitution thing on me at the last minute, and I'm not really a Constitution writer. That's not my thing." So George Mason said, "I already did this for Virginia, so why don't you take this Virginia Constitution and, just put your spin on it for the whole of the United States. That's an easy fix, yeah." So really, George Mason is one of the writers of the United States Constitution, especially the nuts and bolts of it. And that involves a great deal of formal language on how the three branches of the United States government will work together and check one another. You should have learned this all in your civics class. If you haven't, check it out on YouTube, United States Checks and Balances. It's important to note that many of the ideals and political concepts articulated in the U.S. Constitution were borrowed from the Iroquois Confederacy. The Iroquois Confederacy consisted of 6 indigenous American native nations that formed a multi-state government that had been in effect in America long before the United States Constitution. But again, the victors who write the history, and they've pretty much been written out of American history. Well, let's go back to George Mason, because he definitely played a large role in the establishment of the United States via the Constitution and other methods. Throughout his advocacy on how the U.S. should get its start, he consistently expressed the need to abolish slavery. He said in 1773, quote, "Slavery is, quote, a slow poison that is daily contaminating the minds and morals of our people. Every gentleman here is born a petty tyrant, practiced in the acts of despotism and cruelty. We become callous to the dictates of humanity and all the finer feelings of the soul." He also predicted that slavery would bring, quote, "the judgment of heaven upon this country. As nations cannot be rewarded or punished in the next world, they must be in this. By an inevitable chain of causes and effects, Providence punishes national sins by national calamities." So here George Mason was predicting the American Civil War. which was treacherously devastating to America, especially the American South. Just tore that area up, and it still hasn't recovered to this day. And you have to really search hard to find the real history of what happened during the American Civil War and afterwards. What you get now is a lot of ideological sound bites that don't even skim the surface of what was going on there. But needless to say, so much of what happened then is not resolved to this day. There are so many organizations dedicated to Civil War and reenactment because there is so much that remains unresolved and so much trauma in the South because of that war that took place there and how it happened and what happened. And it was a really brutal American war with one side of America fighting against another side of America. Now, in 2020, we had race riots all over the country, and especially in the South, where statues were memorializing the heroes of the Confederacy, which, if you're not American, and even if you are, you may not know that the Confederacy is what that portion of the South that broke off from the rest of America during the Civil War is called. And that happened in the late 1800s, mid to late 1800s was when the states were succeeding from America, and they were saying, you know, I'm not American, I'm not going to be a part of this if I cannot keep my slaves. That was a big part of what it was. And to this day, there's so much spin and attempt to evade the issue of slavery and racism with regard to this war. And there were a lot of issues that were playing out around this war, but you're absolutely lying and pretending if you claim that one of the main issues at the beginning of this war wasn't whether the South was going to be able to keep their slaves. Like, America had been fighting about that ever since George Mason's time. So George Mason is the late 1700s, and this war was breaking out mid to late 1800s. It was a war that completely devastated America. And just like George Mason said, it was a war, in his own words, that, quote, brought the judgment of heaven upon this country. And, you know, it's not that simple, but what you reap is what you sow. There are causes and effects to everything. You cannot keep an entire people opposed and enslaved because of race, create this entire race caste system, and attempt to run your country off of that and not have some pretty dire consequences as a result. And America has had some pretty dire consequences. George Mason was simply one of the founding fathers who happened to have enough foresight to see these consequences on the horizon. And it took about 100 years for what Mason predicted to come to fruition, and it's still coming to fruition. So, what was George Mason's reward for being such an insightful and helpful and even prescient founding father? What's his reward? He was written out of history. Imagine that. That's why most Americans have never heard of him. So this is what happens when you have the audacity to tell your white peer group who are making hand over fist money off of black bodies that there's a problem with this sort of racism. You are erased from the predominant history, like he has been. So let's jump forward and take a look at how racism in America evolved since George Mason's time. A lot of American racism has changed, but a lot has also stayed the same. I have dealt with American racism as it exists today by working with Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 for about 30 years, and I began working with this act in the 1990s. So, here we are in the 2020s in America. I'm here to report that American racism is the same or worse than it ever was. Some people love to argue that it's either gone or it's infinitely better. And they base this argument on the existence of a handful of black people like Oprah, Tyler Perry, Beyonce, the really few. I mean, there's such a small percentage of, what Black America is. But they have these few big household names, and they'll say, these people prove that you can be black and you can make it in America. There's no such thing of racism. It's over. Well, only if it was that simplistic. I think a better litmus test for the end of racism is, can a black person be routinely stopped for a routine traffic violation by the police in America and expect to not be randomly murdered? And the answer is no. Now, you can choose to see that reality as being explained by anything other than racism, and many Americans do exactly that. But they do that because of what I discussed in the last video. It comes from a desire to not engage in any real, authentic discussion of what racism is in America and how it works. And there is a really, really serious push to shut down any authentic conversation about racism in America. And I want you to be considering, why is that? Why is there such a push to just shut down this conversation? You can't even have this conversation. And that was the kind of thing that Prince Harry was talking about in his documentary. Why can't we even begin to have the conversation? Why am I being gaslit out of even having the conversation? Well, we're gonna get into that. We're gonna talk about how that conversation has evolved in America. So let's forward almost 200 years into America's future, from George Mason's time. And so that was the late 1700s. And let's take a quick look at the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This law has been on the book now for about 50 years, and we're going to use this law to take a look over how racism in America has evolved over time. The 64 Civil Rights legislation completely changed the landscape of America as we know it. It outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. Without this law, there would not be the household names that you know today. There would be no Oprah Winfrey. There would be no Tyler Perry. There would be no Serena Williams. There would be no Beyonce. These people could not have come into existence without this law. Because prior to this law, African Americans were completely forbidden from participating in any American commerce. Now, it wasn't like there wasn't any commerce for African Americans, because there was, because everyone needs commerce to live. But it was an extremely segregated form of commerce, with African Americans only engaging in commerce with other African Americans. And this led to these African American communities being routinely attacked once this form of segregated commerce led to the accumulation of any kind of wealth. And there are numerous instances of this. So Black Wall Street in Oklahoma is one of the most notorious, because that was a very wealthy town in Oklahoma. It was wiped out. It was just a real bloody massacre. And this is not the only time this happened. This happened all over America, wherever you had that black wealth being accumulated. And so, because the whole segregated form of commerce and lifestyle was not working, African Americans began working on integration as a new business model for upward mobility and wealth accumulation. So in the 1950s and the early 1960s, along comes Martin Luther King, as well as many others engaging in, this peaceful and nonviolent civil rights movement, where people were being turned into jelly jam. That's my term. I know it's an odd one. I'll explain it right now. What I'm saying is that people were beaten so bloody and so battered, and many times they were killed, that the violence caused the people to resemble jelly jam. And I know I'm being flippant with that, but that's what I mean by the term. Why was this happening to these protesters in the 60s? Because they were requesting basic civil and human rights like walking on sidewalks, drinking water out of operable fountains, using public bathrooms, eating lunch at a restaurant, riding the bus without being harassed to move to the back of it. So, all the country is watching this. It's being televised in many instances how badly these peaceful, nonviolent people are being beaten. So, in a nationally televised address on June 6, 1963, President John F. Kennedy, the American president at that time, was talking about some legislation that he had in the works that's going to guarantee equal treatment of every American regardless of race. And he had support for this, but he also had a tremendous amount of opposition to this. There were some people in the country that was really ready for this to happen. There were others in the country that were completely against this happening. And believe it or not, these polarizations, these divides do not always occur based on race. It occurs based on people's appetite for and ability to change. So, JFK said, let's do this. Let's pass a law that makes everyone equal. A lot of change. By November of 1963, he was dead. So, he has this conversation about passing this law in June of 1963. November of 1963, he is dead. And most believe it's because he had the audacity to propose this law. And so, for me, this is evidence of how deadly honest and authentic conversations around race can be, not just in America, but you see how it's played out in America. So in June of 1963, JFK points out to most of America, we might have a tad bit of a problem with racism. Just a smidge, just a little. Do you see all these good, decent people being turned into jelly jam because they want to eat lunch? I think we should fix this. I don't want America to be a racist country. Do you? And just for trying to have that conversation, this man ends up dead. Now, there are a lot of controversies and conspiracies around his assassination. People say he was trying to do other stuff. He might have been. But I'm just saying, this conversation around racism in America was one of the things that he was doing that America really was not trying to take on. So this is what I mean about racism being baked into the structure of America. From the very start of America, we have these founding fathers debating the morality of slavery. George Mason says, yeah, this is an ugly thing, this racism, it's going to destroy us, it's not good for us, it's not good for us as white people. And honestly, I think that a lot of white people really feel that way. They're like, this is not good for us. What is it doing to us? What is it doing to our souls and, our own morality? This is not a good thing. And George Mason had a lot of peers that are like, yeah, we know that it's wrong. And we know we're doing really weird things by instituting slavery in America. And we know that we seem incredibly hypocritical as we try to justify it. We're all second sons, and we came running from Europe from the history of that oppression that comes from that. We are balking against this idea that only the firstborn son should inherit from his father and is the only person that has any value of in a family. That's why we are saying all men are created equal. We had to travel halfway across the world to institute that idea. And in that way, Prince Henry is similar to the founding fathers of America. He's a second son in, this British hierarchy, this monarchy, and he sort of rejected how that has resulted in his life being stifled in some ways, and he's been prevented from pursuing some of the things that he wanted to pursue. But when it comes to American racism, there were decisions made at the very start just to sidestep the conversation. There's never any conversation of how, maybe these black men that we have enslaved are, maybe we should think about how they were created and who says they weren't created equal. There was never that conversation. There certainly wasn't any entertaining of that idea with regard to women of any race. So women were not being seriously considered with regard to any rights or any privileges or any laws. And this is a reality that is even more quiet kept than racial oppression in America. We don't talk about what has happened with women in America who have really only started having legal rights of, a certain freedom within their own right as late as the 70s. But can't get into that here. That's a whole other topic. In the founding of America, you rarely see racism addressed as directly as George Mason addressed it. And for doing that, he gets written out of history. There are historians that argue it wasn't that simple, and unlike other founding fathers, Mason just wasn't being that corruptive in the creation of history. And to be fair, these are valid points, but the state of Virginia matched your Mirror Mason, so it's hard to make the argument stick that all of America couldn't do the same and honor what contributions George Mason made to history. So I think it's a little bit of racism, just a tad, just a smidge. So 100 years later, you have a war fought that divides America and causes so much death and destruction to all sides, and some people who didn't even have a dog in the fight. Like, for example, the Irish immigrants who just happened to have the misfortune to immigrate from Ireland to America during the time that America was fighting the Civil War, and they got caught up into it. The longer America continues with its racist structures and not confronting the racist ideology head on, the longer you have this festering division about race and racism that sucks up all kinds of people, and it continues to this very day. But let's go back to the 1960s. After President Kennedy's assassination in November of 1963, President Lyndon Johnson, along with other key Democrats, pushed hard to secure the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Now, do any of you have any idea how many people, black and white, died for this comprehensive piece of legislation to even be considered? And do you have any idea how many people passionately advocated for the act? So passionately that they were willing to die for it and lose everything that they had over it, family, friends, just to have a shot at the oppressive conditions around race in America changing for them just a little bit. I mean, can you imagine how bad it had to be for you to risk everything, even your life? And furthermore, do you have any idea how many people, again, black and white, were completely against this legislation being passed and desperately wanted everything to remain the same because they were benefiting from the status quo? Or if not benefiting, they were at least safe in the status quo. Because you have to understand that attempting to change this particular status quo in America has almost always been a bloody, gruesome, and violent undertaking. And a lot of people in America, regardless of race, don't want to get involved in this particular bloody and violent struggle. And can you blame them? People on both sides of the division are willing to fight and die bloody, violent deaths to maintain and uphold what they believe in. And when you understand American conversations on race in the context that they've really been in, bloodshed, violence, even civil war, even a presidential assassination in 2020, riots, a whole entire summer of riots, and that kind of destruction that goes along with that. It's not without bloodshed. It's not without violence. You can begin to understand why a lot of people just don't even want to have the conversation, are terrified of having the conversation. What are the answers? I don't know, because certain people are not going to stop wanting to have these conversations. It impacts their life too much and too hard for them to just not want to have the conversations. I do think that at a minimum, in order to productively have these conversations, one has to understand the history, the violence, the dissension, and what is at stake when one attempts to have the conversation. That's the best I got for you. And I've been doing this for 30 years. So, any questions that you have for me about having conversations on race or racism, I'm here for it. I have a lot of experience in it, and I can tell you probably the best way to go about it. If you want to know. Emily, your Everyday Lightworker, signing off.